For some weeks now, there has been increasing concern for those who track the conflict that is unfolding in West Asia about tensions that have been rising between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, being the Lebanese militant group. For weeks and months now, there have been rising tensions between these two entities. And what we saw yesterday, that has, of course, doubtless been flashing over all your news headlines, is that there was an exchange of missiles and rocket barrages between Israel and Hezbollah just yesterday. It happened on Sunday, and today, of course, everyone's waking up and talking about the ramifications of these attacks. Hezbollah launching, by its own admission, a large barrage of drones and missiles and rockets towards Israel. Israel, of course, responding with preemptive strikes of its own. So there's a lot of confusion today about what does this mean? Does this mean an escalation in the conflict, or according to some experts, it actually means that the much-awaited confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah has actually turned out to be fairly limited in the context of the wider war that is taking place in West Asia at this point in time. Joining us now is Kabir Taneja, joining us on India Today Global to discuss what's been going on, what exactly happened last night, and what it means for the region more generally. Kabir, could you just begin by laying out very, very basically what happened on Sunday between Israel and Hezbollah?
Thanks, Shashank. So basically what has happened is, first and foremost, that we know that Hezbollah was building some sort of large-scale attack, something similar to what we saw in April, if you remember. And what has happened this time, though, is that the Israelis have apparently launched a counter much before the full-scale attack would take place. According to Israel's own sort of releases, they launched over 100 fighter jets to target ammunition and drone launch pads in southern Lebanon. So it's very sort of course, we know that Israel's intelligence within Lebanon is quite good, and they know usually in most places what is going on. But the fact that even Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah has given a speech since, basically saying that this is the first phase, so to speak, on avenging the death or assassination actually of Fawd Shukr, who's a senior Hezbollah member, almost a right-hand man to Hassan Nasrallah himself. And it's interesting because this has nothing to do by Hezbollah's own admission with either Iran or with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, which was the sort of segue to this any kind of escalation taking place.
Right.
So the fact that they have sort of limited this right now to a Hezbollah-Israel kind of thing also gives both the parties to basically, now that this is done, to sort of work on some kind of de-escalation and make sure that this does not spill over into something bigger than they would both like to get into.
Right. Could you just lay out a little bit more about, what the tensions have been between Israel and Hezbollah since the October 7th attacks? We know, of course, that right after the October 7th attacks took place, Hamas, of course, assaulting Israel. There was, I think, right the next day, I believe, Hezbollah also launched several strikes against Israel. Could you talk a little bit about what has happened over the last year since the conflict began between Israel and Hamas? What has Hezbollah's position been on this, and how it fits into the broader panoply of conflict that we're seeing in the region?
Yeah. I mean, look, Hezbollah's construct historically has been on an anti-Israel position, right? So for a long period of time, it was a militant organization, still is. Predominantly, but over the years it has metamorphosized itself into the political system of Lebanon as well. They have had elected representation in the Lebanese parliament. It's very ingrained into its ideological position against the very existence of the Israeli state. Now, what has happened since October 7th has been interesting, actually. Technically, Hezbollah and Hamas are part of what Iran calls its axis of resistance, basically a stitch-up of groups that the Iranians support both politically, ideologically, and militarily in their quest against, their own self-determined ideological aims, but also their position against Israel and the US by extension. So, but interestingly, since then, we actually don't see a lot of commonality when it comes to operations between Hamas and Hezbollah. If you remember, in October, November last year, Hamas made public calls for Hezbollah to open the northern front and sort of attack Israel from the north, so that it's a two-front war. Hezbollah actually did not do that. Hezbollah almost maintained, if not neutral, its own position that yes, it is against what has happened in Gaza, it's against the war in Gaza, and it supports Hamas in that front, but it did not militarily get too embroiled into it. Now, even right now, going back to what I said earlier, their current military escalation with Israel is based on the assassination of one of their own senior members, and not necessarily what has happened in Iran with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, or what is happening in Gaza. So it's a very interesting dynamic, which is a very, at least they are positioning themselves to be as a very Israel versus Hezbollah dynamic, and not part of any sort of larger regional conflagration as of now.
Right. Could you explain a little bit of that? Why exactly? You're saying it's interesting. You're saying that they're not trying to associate with what's happened with Ismail Haniyeh. That's been some of the analysis, that this was somehow a response to what happened in Tehran with the assassination of the Hamas political chief. Why exactly is Hezbollah taking this position where it's actually followed a slightly, as you're suggesting, a slightly divergent path from what Hamas has taken?
I don't think it's divergent. I think I think a group like Hezbollah is basically expecting that if there is an institutional response to Israel, whether it's on assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, or whether it's on assassination of Oust or anyone else, basically, or what is happening in Gaza, right? That all the parties involved need to have agency in it. Now, which is very interesting, because basically, I think what Hezbollah is trying to say, it wants a larger direct role of Iran itself, and not just the proxy groups that Iran supports, whether it's the Houthis, Hamas, or Hezbollah. All those align as far as their ideological inclination against Israel and existence of Israel is concerned. But I think, for example, Hezbollah on behalf of Iran said after Ismail Haniyeh's assassination that, of course, Iran is going to give a befitting reply to Israel on what has happened. Now, that has not taken place yet. So I think all these groups are also on an individual level, playing out their own risk assessments, and that if they do take on Israel directly, and considering how much military equipment the Americans have moved to the region and can mobilize in support of Israel, they can face significant setbacks both on manpower and financial institutions. Right. So, do they want to take that risk if Iran is being risk averse itself right now? I think that is where the differentiation is taking place.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit now about Iran, right, and how it's fit into this conflict? Because I feel like I think our viewers and people more generally have a sense that, look, we understand the Israel-Hamas piece of this conflict, but I think that for people who are less well versed with what's happening on the Lebanon side, of course, because in the last weeks and months, we've also seen more of this side. We've seen Iran come into the picture as well. Could you tell us a little bit about how has Iran's policy evolved since the October 7th attacks? What are its calculations about what's happening? You're saying that it's, of course, being slightly risk averse as well. What is the calculation on the Iranian side? If you can explain how Iran fits in now to what is happening.
So I think Iran, first and foremost, I think people need to realize is a very, very smart player, right? It often does not come as such, and often is also seen as a country sort of very, attracted to risk, to put it simply. But, what Iran has done right now is that it has not directly interfered into any of these conflagrations. For Hezbollah, a group like Hezbollah, Hamas, they technically share borders with Israel. Right. So in Gaza, you can't escape the geographically Israel, and in southern Lebanon, you can't escape geographically Israel. Iran is actually fairly far away from Israel. There is Syria in the middle, there's Iraq in the middle, and so on and so forth. So, so Iran plays on that a lot. The fact that it is not directly involved, but it supports any and every group in the region that wants to take on Israel for what it is doing in Gaza, and so on and so forth. How that sort of plays out is it's difficult. For example, over the past month and a half, when everyone was expecting an Iranian response against Israel, Iran was very busy, basically figuring out what its political domestic process is going to be.
Right.
Mahmoud Pezeshkian has taken over. What is Mahmoud Pezeshkian's stance? What is he going to do?
Right.
What does he represent? And also building that bridge between Pezeshkian's wants, needs, and requirements, or even demands, with the realities of how much can be achieved with the Ayatollah Khamenei actually being the real power center, along with the IRGC.
Right.
They have, for the past month and a half, they have been figuring that out. They can't get into a direct confrontation while having their domestic politics not settled in.
Right.
Now that it is getting settled in, we will see a more clear view on what kind of positions Iran is going to take. We've already seen Pezeshkian, making clear statements against Israel, basically aligning much more with the IRGC and the Ayatollah's viewpoint, even though he's seen as a moderate. And not a conservative or an ultra conservative. So I think over the next 3, 4, or 5 weeks, maybe we'll get a bit more clarity on the Iranian thinking. But for the past month and a half, 2 months, they've been basically consolidating their own domestic political postures before they can have any sort of adventurous
Right.
outlook on their position on Israel.
Yeah, could I ask you a little bit could you help us zoom out a little bit and just tell us a little bit about where this leaves the broader conflict in West Asia? Of course, lots of headlines that tend to swamp our understanding of what the state of play is right now, where Israel is in its campaign in Gaza, and how, what impact, if any, this latest conflagration with Hezbollah is going to have on Israel's calculation of its conflict, what it means for, let's say, the peace process that the United States and other countries like Egypt and the UAE have been trying to push. Could you give us a sense of, just zoom out a little bit and tell us where we are right now in the conflict in West Asia?
Look, I think this conflict, for the time being at least, is going to go well into next year. I personally don't see either Israel or Hamas coming to any sort of conclusion as far as the ceasefire talks are concerned before the American elections are given, or the
Right.
results of the American elections come out, because they will have to deal with whoever the next president is going to be. If it's going to be, let's say, Kamala Harris, there may be a continuity and maybe a larger prospect of a ceasefire, let's say, early next year, or any kind of deal with Hamas early next year. If it's Trump, then you're in a bit of a gray zone, right? You don't know, and neither does Hamas, and neither does Israel,
Sure.
because Trump is more of an isolationist, right? Rather than getting more embroiled into these kind of conflicts. He, in his previous term, also he's made no bones about getting the US out of these kind of issues rather than get more embroiled in. So I don't see any major breakthroughs as far as political processes are concerned till next year. Now, having said that, that is a problem within Israel. The Gaza campaign is not abating. They have made no bones about the fact that they want to destroy Hamas, and they've made no bones about that they want to take out Yahya Sinwar after Ismail Haniyeh.
Right.
So so I think those military options on the table for Israel are continuing to go ahead and will go ahead. Now, the problem here is that there are internal differences within Israel that are coming out. Recently, we saw the chief of defense of Israel and the chief of even Shin Bet, which is their domestic intelligence agency,
Right.
basically coming out and saying that, look, there is still no political process. What are we going to do after the military intervention?
Right.
Who is going to take charge of Gaza? Because if you don't take charge of Gaza, if someone else doesn't take charge of Gaza, you will have a vacuum where Hamas is going to regroup. So, what is the political process? And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been unable to give an answer to that, let alone to the international community, but to his own constituencies within Israel, right? So the military doesn't know what the political process is. The intel doesn't know what the political process is,
Right.
and the demands asking for clarity on that are really not coming through from the political brass. So
Right.
there are those differentiations. We see, there are the continuation of protests inside Israel against Israeli policies,
Sure.
and the fact that there has been a failure of getting the hostages back, or there has been a failure of a sense of urgency to get the hostages back.
Right.
Now, that's a very multi-dimensional, multi-layered crisis within Israel. Even from a perspective of Netanyahu, despite his, let's say, unpopularity or even popularity within certain sections, look, if you are an Israeli prime minister, do you want to be the face of a failed negotiation with Hamas where you give political concessions, right? Even if you do that in return for hostages, you will be known as that person who basically bowed down to Hamas.
Right.
Do you want to be that person, especially if the probability of it blowing up in your face is high? So it's very, very multi-layered. It's not simple. Even when we hear a lot about the ceasefire, it's a very complicated process. And at least till the American elections are finished and there is an outcome with the new sort of presidency coming in, I personally don't see any major breakthroughs coming.
Right. So you talked about the Israeli side of the equation. Could I ask you to talk about Hamas, Iran, how they're seeing the conflict? Are they digging their heels in? Of course, how does the death of Ismail Haniyeh impact things with the leadership of course, someone like Yahya Sinwar coming in. Could you tell us a little bit about the Hamas calculation and the Iranian calculation? Are they going to look at this and say that, look, make the same calculation that you're saying, that, look, until a new American president comes in, this is going nowhere, essentially?
Look, with the coming in of, first of all, Yahya Sinwar being appointed as the chief of Hamas, I think caught a lot of people by surprise. Usually the chief, when the Hamas Politburo, let's say, chief is removed or is killed in this case, usually we get another person from the political brass of Hamas to take over.
Right.
Yahya Sinwar was the head of the military brass in Gaza, right? So he was handling Gaza. He was part of the attack that took place in October. And in the aftermath, he is the basically voice of power in Gaza. Now there are no political offices or military offices. Yahya Sinwar is the centrality of power in Hamas. He decides what happens, right? So earlier, even if let's say there were differences between someone like Ismail Haniya and Yahya Sinwar, or even if Ismail Haniya wanted Yahya Sinwar to give more concessions so that they can get, let's say, a deal done, all those processes, as far as I see it, are now removed. So it has come down to basically a very Netanyahu versus Sinwar equation, right? So even when we listen to, let's say, someone like Egypt, Qatar, or the US saying that they have made progress, they're talking about making progress between Egypt, Qatar, and US.
Right.
We are not talking about progress between the Israelis or the Hamas. Unless we get to that stage where we are in a process where concessions can be made in there, I don't see any sort of major breakthroughs coming in. Even if there is a ceasefire signed, I don't see it holding out for more than month and a half at max.
Understood. So let me just close with then what we began with. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the missile barrages that we've seen over yesterday is largely a limited confrontation. What we're going to have to really see in the coming weeks is, once Iran sorts out its domestic contestations, what sort of policy they're going to take. Am I understanding you correctly in saying that, in fact, you don't see this having these missile attacks and barrages having a major impact on where the conflict is going more generally?
I think they're expecting old school kinetic response to Israel right now may not happen. I think Iran will calculate what kind of pushback it is going to get, what kind of other processes can get derailed if it sort of gets into that kind of position. Even its closest allies in Russia and China would not want Iran to be bogged down in a full confrontation. Russia, banks on Iranian technologies for its own war front with Ukraine. China buys fairly cheap oil from Iran and would also like to has a strategic deal with Iran that goes into multiple billions of dollars. If Iran gets into that, then it's at least 10-20 years of complete economic destitution, more than what it is facing right now. Now, whether it wants to take that to its people, I'm not particularly sure. Like a recent speech that the Ayatollah gave, he increasingly mentioned other avenues of contestation, such as cyber, such as or taking on Israeli institutions in other formats, not necessarily in an old conventional war. So this is going to be a very drawn down affair, I think. I personally don't see an immediate response from the Iranians. I think that clock has gone now. The Americans have also moved enough armory near Israel that they can thwart any kind of incoming projectiles, as they showed in April also.
Understood.
So yeah, unless they want to do it for posturing, which will have very limited returns, I don't see that kind of confrontation taking place.
Understood. Kabir Taneja, thank you so much for joining us in India Today Global, really breaking down what exactly we're seeing in West Asia right now, putting the missile barrages and attacks that we've seen between Israel and Hezbollah into context, and also just laying out how intractable and difficult the conflict has become, as well as negotiations for a ceasefire. Will absolutely continue to track this story. But thank you again, Kabir, for joining us, and thank you so much for watching India Today Global. We will keep you absolutely updated with coverage of this, as well as, of course, today there's the India-Singapore 3+3 meeting, which we will cover and keep you fully updated on. So please do watch us here on India Today Global. Thank you so much again.